Hello and welcome to week 6. Is it week 6 in the psychology of personality? And what we're looking at in chapter 8 is really the advent of the humanist movement. I mean, a lot of this class is actually like the history of psychology because we're sort of in this linear way of looking at the theories of personality as they came about as a result of time passing. So the humanists came along, and the essence of humanism was a reaction against two other fields of thought, and that one was the deterministic aspects of Freudian theory, was the id, the ego, and the superego, largely below our awareness, are controlling our behaviors. And then you had behaviorism, which is saying, factors within the environment are controlling. And the humanists, or the philosophers that developed humanism, started to think, well, what about human agency? What about free will? What about, are we just subject to a script that's being developed by our unconscious or by expectations within our environment that we have no control over? And of course, even intuitively, we can say, no, that's not the case. But we needed a new model. So along came the humanist, and for the sake of this chapter, we're going to be looking at two of them. One is Carl Rogers, and the other one is Abraham Maslow. Now, Carl Rogers, interestingly enough, was a therapist, and his model of personality was very applied. It was very much how he worked with clients. And there is probably no other individual within the history of psychology that has had more impact on the present day basic skill set of doing counseling than Rogers had. First and foremost was his unconditional positive regard, his statement that said, when you're sitting down with another human being, above all, everything they've ever done, everything they've wished they've done, wherever the individual is at, they are deserving of a caring individual who will provide them with a human positive regard. He also had now this went very counter to sort of like the legalistic sort of punitive ways in which we dealt with mental illness or with people who had aberrant behavior. Another area that he looked at was the therapeutic use of self. That me as an individual, if I'm a therapist, my skill set, my perspective, all those are my best tools. Just me being me as a functional human being, hopefully a couple steps ahead of my client, and that is the best skill that I bring there. These philosophies, even though many, many different kinds of therapies exist, those two ideas, the therapeutic use of self and the unconditional positive regard, remain pillars of the way therapists are taught to deal with their clients. Now, his personality theory is a fascinating combination of psychology and sociology. Now, a little graphic here for you to take a look at. So here we have his model of the self. And what we see, the components of the self, are three different kinds of notions here. We have the real self. This is the person you really are, whatever that description is. Then you have the self-image. This is the self that you portray to the world. This is how other people see you. And then there's the ideals that you feel you should be. Now, this graphic actually shows two states of being where one individual on the left these components are incongruent. Their real self is not aligned completely with their self-image, which is also not aligned with their ideal self. And then we have the congruent self, where the real self, self-image, and ideal self are largely very similar to one another. Now, Rogers proposed this as a personality theory, but it was also a focus of treatment. So individuals who came to see him and the people who followed Rogerian principles and whatnot felt that individuals felt stress when their real self was out of line with their ideal self, which was out of line with their social self. Now, changes can happen in any one of those. Maybe the expectations for an ideal self are just astronomically high. You need to lower that bar. Maybe you have to get rid of some of those expectations of how other people see you so that you can realistically align your true self with your self image. And the progress of therapy was the gradual integration of all three of these cells into a congruent whole. Now, at the same time, there's also a developmental process here. We are born largely integrated. Very young children, they say it like it is. They are who they are. They're perfect the way they are. So we can actually look at young children and say their ideal self, self-image, and their true selves are fairly aligned. As we begin to negotiate social relationships, expectations from the outside, role models that are presented to us, ideal ways of living that we're not necessarily living up to, setting goals for ourselves. Every time we do that, we're sort of separating those pieces. This is a healthy, normal process of human development that goes through the lifespan where those peak, and then the life that we lead is to integrate all of those that in our late life they become reintegrated. So we start integrated, then we go through a social process of social interactions and setting goals and having ideals for ourselves, and then finally later in life people become much more aligned. Like, as if anybody's worked with the elderly, you know that oftentimes their real self, self-image, and ideal self are anything they damn well sell it's going to be, and they say it just like it is, and they don't worry about other people's thoughts about them or whatever. They are highly integrated individuals in that sense, very much like young children. Now, we have that theory, which proposes all kinds of agency, all kinds of ability for people to construct and work on their personality and make personality changes, you know, without, the need of external reinforcement and, some sort of resolution of id and superego powers that are going on. Very, very fundamental move away from that. We also have Abraham Maslow's. Now, Maslow's theory, in essence, is not a personality theory, it's a motivation theory. It's a driver of change. But rather than seeing energy to change being associated with the resolution of conflicts of id and ego, or the behavioral consequences of the environment, or even the integration of the self, Maslow theorized that there were stages that corresponded to the needs that we have, going from our most basic needs to our most high level needs, which is called self actualization. Even there's another stage called transcendence. And his concept was that all human beings are being drawn to self actualization and transcendence. It's, rather than we're climbing the hill, we're actually being drawn up the hill by the desire of all human beings to transcend the physical nature and limitations of our world. Maslow brought to us probably the most well-known theory of motivation slash personality slash behavior known, and that is this hierarchy of needs. So not only do we have a variety of needs that we are set out to meet over the course of our lifespan, to prioritize them. And it's a weird prioritization because the basic needs in the model sort of suggest that they have to be met before we go to the next stage. So, for example, if we look at this classic graphic, our physiological needs, the most basic, air, water, food, shelter, sleep, clothing, reproduction, we have to make sure that that's set. Then it allows us to move to the next level of needs, safety needs, which then allows us to move to the next needs, into esteem, and finally to self-actualization and potentially even transcendence. However, we have to recognize that the end goal, self-actualization and transcendence, is really the motivation. That's where the magnet is. We're being pulled through that. In Maslow's earliest work, he concurred that people had to meet lower needs before they could move on to higher needs. It wasn't until much later that he recognized, simply by examples that were in the world, individuals that, for example, for Gandhi, who went through forced starvation. He self-starved himself in response to the continued totalitarian type government that was going on in India by the UK. So he was able to sacrifice his basic needs in order to meet higher level needs. So he just kind of skipped over those. And Maslow had to contend with those realities and said, well, maybe they're just sort of there, and they can be met at different times. And sometimes, for example, let's say a person who's longs for love and belonging, but yet is in an abusive relationship which threatens their safety, but yet that higher order need, love and belonging, for at least a period of time, will hold that person in the relationship despite the physical danger that's in there. So he had to realize that the higher order needs were so powerful that sometimes we may even neglect the lower needs in order to move on. Now, that said, I found the application of Maslow's hierarchy to be incredibly useful when having discussions about the goals that my clients would set in a social work setting. So, an individual, for example, may want to self-actualize. They may have big goals about what they want to do with their lives. For now, we're going to focus on making sure you have food, shelter, water, health care, all of that stuff. Let's take care of that first. It's not minimizing those higher needs. It's helping me as a helper focus on the things that I can change that make it more likely that they're going to be able to achieve the next stages. Now, we also know that within rehabilitation, for example, that there is a philosophy called work first. Now, that work first came along as a response in the rehab world to the notion that individuals with severe and profound and pervasive mental illness needed to go through a number of steps of recovery before they were, quote unquote, work ready. Now, similar to the hierarchy here, where the higher order need to have a job and feel independence and feel worthiness and have money coming in, those higher needs can often serve as a magnet to draw people through those, what they need to do in those lower levels of need. So the philosophy in rehab switched to work first. If an individual, let's say, has never had a job, they've lived on disability at this point in their life, let's face it, not too much reason to get up out of bed. But the individual who has a job and responsibilities and can be connected motivationally to those goals, that might be enough for that individual to make the changes at the lower end to make sure they can experience those higher end goals. And you see sort of that later stage Maslow thinking about the higher order things being so important. That's sometimes where we start in order to get change happening at the lower levels. So that's a lot of information that's not necessarily associated with covering this particular theory in personality, but nonetheless, it's an extremely useful. I've taken out that graphic, sat it down with a client, and said, how do you think you're going to achieve all these? Literally using that graphic as a, and then when they have those higher order ones, I want to have a I want to have a family, or I want to, live independently and be proud of my existence on earth and stuff. That becomes the higher order motivation when they have to go through the day-to-day struggle of building a whole new life with whole new skills and whatnot. So it's a very, very useful tool that way. Now, the discussion has to do with Maslow's focus on values as being important. And it's a quirky discussion, kind of came out of my imagination with the sort of rhetoric that's going on in politics these days. And I know that that's a really dicey topic right now, particularly, I mean, as I record this, the government is shut down. There's all kinds of weird things going on, scary things going on. And we hear a lot of statements about values. Now, humanists really, really focused, particularly if in its Western, uh, in its Western sort of manifestation, on individual integrity. So we have you know, um, the non I'm trying to think, what is it? The unconditional positive regard. We have that, of the individual, and then we have this journey to self-actualization of an individual and how important the individual is, and those. How does that contrast with what you hear in the rhetoric that's going on, the political statements that are out there in terms of care for the individual and those values? So let's have a discussion about that. And then the quiz, 2 questions. The first one, I have, it's sort of a critical thinking question. Basically, what does it mean to you as an individual to understand Roger's perspective of the unique experiential field limit? Now, to get some clarity on what I'm looking for in this, when he says the unique experiential field limit, it is a self-imposed perception that there's a limit of some kind for me to be able to empathize with somebody. There's a limit. The unique experiential field of the client is a limit. We are limited by that. I want you to think about that and come up with the definition for that phrase. And then we're going to look at Roger's self, and that many of us have spent many years living incongruent lives because that is the nature of being an adult. Oftentimes we have to sacrifice, and oftentimes we can't say what we really want to say because it's socially inappropriate, or our ideals are not achievable at this time, or something like that. I want you to share with me an example of where you have a characteristic where one or both of, one or all of these aspects of the self is not aligned at this point. And explain that. So you basically, there's three definitions: a characteristic of you that has a definition that's real, one that's ideal, and one that the public knows. So discussing and sharing with me an example of that. That brings us to the end of chapter 8 and the humanist movement, a very, very kind of a turning point in our study of personality here, and the introduction of humanism as a philosophy that is countering the deterministic type of approaches to psychology and personality that existed up until that time. So, enjoy this chapter. Look forward to seeing you on the discussion boards, and have a great week.